I have the privilege now of introducing our keynote speaker. His name is Professor Paul Ewart. There's a PowerPoint slide if you want to put it up. Paul is someone I have met on a few occasions at Christian in Science or Faraday conferences, but I don't know him very well, except as you'll hear, he's from Northern Ireland, so you'll get the lovely accent as well. Where did I write this down? Let's see. Yeah, so Paul was born and raised in Belfast. He graduated with a bachelor's and PhD in physics from Queen's University, Belfast, did postdoc research at the Blackett Laboratory, Imperial College, London, and in '79 moved as a lecturer to the physics department at Oxford University, where later became head of atomic and laser physics. And during that time, he held a Royal Academy of Engineering 5-year senior research fellowship and visiting fellowships at Joint Institute of Laboratory Astrophysics in Boulder, USA, and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and the University of Otago, New Zealand. So a great international man, as well as international speaker. He has served the executive chair of Christians in Science, and after a spell as director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge, he returned to Oxford, where he's currently Emeritus Professor of Physics. Hallelujah. I made it through that. Amazing introduction. Before he comes up, I forgot to mention earlier, there are some tables around. So in the courtyard, there are book tables. Those books are all from my personal stock. They're just for display, but there's one table kind of on general science and faith, another table that has some on physics, some on evolution, creation, some on genetics, some on other different things. But have a look, peruse through those, and all those books are, available if you want to buy them. There's another book table in the corner where Paul has kindly brought some spare books from conferences that haven't sold yet, and he's willing to just give those for free, or if you're able to give a donation, there's a little box, which would be great if you could donate something. And then there are lots of brochures out there, fantastic brochures. Just be aware that, don't just take one of every one, take the ones that you're particularly interested in. There's about 5 of each. So, and with that, I will just say Paul is coming up. He's giving 2 talks. The first one is called Science and Faith, Friend or Foe. And the second one will be more on being a Christian in science. So I think I won't give you the abstract. I'll let you explain what your talk is about. Come on up, Paul. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. If I'd known, I'd have written an even briefer bio. But thank you for the invitation to be with you today. It's a real joy and a privilege to be here. I'm especially honored that you've asked me to give 2 talks. I don't often get asked back after I've given a talk, so being asked to give 2 when you haven't heard the first one. Anyway, let's get started. Daniel has given a very succinct and interesting introduction to the topic, of course, the relationship between science and the Christian faith in particular, and outlined the misunderstanding that often exists, both about the nature of science and about the nature of our faith. And so the first talk this morning will be about this sort of general relationship between science and faith, and how they relate to one another. And so if we, I've got a little button I can press to tell you that the title actually has a subtitle, Friends or Foes. Obviously, we're aware of the conflict idea that's persistent in our society today, that we see science and faith as enemies, some kind of foes. This afternoon, I'll be giving another talk which will be more addressed about how we can live as a scientist and as a Christian, how we can bring them both together in harmony, and what the reasons for that are, and some of the challenges that we might face in living as a Christian in science. But let me start off with a couple of questions. first question that came to me, I think, as a child, honestly, I did wonder, why is the sky blue? Perhaps you've got children of your own. Perhaps you asked that question, and maybe, in fact, most of you know the answer to that. How many people, put your hands up if you think you know the answer to that question. Why is the sky blue? Yeah, there's a couple of people who know. Yeah. Vague ideas. Most people, are you not really interested in why the sky is blue? Okay. Well, there's a second question, and that is, why does it matter? I mean, who cares? Has to be some color, but that's not the sense of it. I want to know if we can give an explanation as to why the sky is blue. Does that tell us anything? Is it significant that we can understand why the sky is blue? Now, I'm not going to embarrass anybody who put their hand up and ask them to explain, but let me run through briefly what it is. We've heard this morning that the white light from the sun contains all the colors, and Newton, of course, was the one who used a prism to split it up into the spectrum. He wasn't actually the first person to do this. A Muslim scholar several hundred years earlier had done that and realized that the light was made up of these colors. He didn't get the recognition he deserved. However, what we have here is a prism splitting the colors up, and it does that because the light of different colors interacts differently with the glass, and they have different wavelengths. The longer wavelength is a wave of electricity and magnetism, and the long waves are red, and the shorter ones are blue. Well, so what? How does that explain why the sky is blue? Well, it doesn't really. What you have to realize is that the light which comes over our heads from the sun into the sky above us comes through the air molecules. And these air molecules get disturbed by the light wave, and they oscillate. And they've got a kind of natural oscillation frequency like a pendulum. And it turns out that the molecules like oscillating at the wavelength or the frequency of the blue waves. And so they interact with waves of blue light more, and they scatter it sideways in all different directions. And that means that most of the blue light gets scattered sideways, and the red light carries on through. And so when we look up, we see the blue light, and that's why the sky is blue. Isn't that wonderful? Well, now you know, okay? Anybody asks you why the sky is blue, it's because the air molecules scatter the blue light sideways more than the red light. Now, if that's true, of course, then that explains also why the sky is red at night. Because what you see coming through more of the atmosphere is the light that's left over, and that's mostly red. So that's why the sky turns red at sunsets. So the interesting thing there, of course, is that the truth of one idea is consistent with the other, that the same reason why the sky is blue gives the same explanation as why the sky is red. So it's important to realize that if one thing is true in one area, it has to be consistent with the truth in another area. And so that's an important idea, that truth has to be truth everywhere. All truth meshes together in a coherent way. I think Daniel has already quoted in his introduction earlier, a few months ago, that all truth is God's truth, that saying attributed to St. Augustine. So truth in the science is consistent with the truth that we learn about God. It has to come together in some way. So here's another question. When I run colors of the sky, why is the sky black at night? Pardon? There's no sun. Well, actually, there's a few million suns up there when you look at it, you know. Now, it's a curious question because it used to be thought that the universe was infinite, and it had always been there, forever and ever. And so if that were true, then if this universe is full of stars forever and ever, then no matter where you looked, in any direction, eventually your eye would come upon a star. There'd be so many of them that you couldn't avoid seeing a star in every part of the sky. So the sky should not be black, it should be white. It should be all filled with light. This is Olber's paradox. How can you square that with an infinite universe or an eternal universe? Well, the answer is you can't. And the reason is because the universe is not infinite. It doesn't go on forever, and it hasn't been there forever. And so the interesting thing is that actually this scientific question raises an existential question, if you like, about our existence. Where do we fit into this universe if it has never had a beginning and there's some finite size? It's actually, we know now, expanding. Space itself is expanding. And we're a bit uncertain as to what the eventual outcome will be. It may be it'll turn around and collapse, but the general trend now is to think that it's going to go on, getting thinner and thinner as it expands, and eventually all the atoms will be infinitely spread out, and it'll be a really dull place. It's called the heat death of the universe. So these scientific questions lead on to these sort of interesting metaphysical questions. Why is that going to happen? What's it for? Is there any purpose if that's the end of things? Well, science, of course, gives us an explanation of what's going on, and we sum it up in what's called the Big Bang, that about 13.5 billion years ago, there was this giant explosion from what we call a quantum fluctuation of some elementary fields, and then it rapidly expanded, inflated, that very rapid expansion, and then the first atoms and molecules started to be formed as the universe cooled from billions of degrees initially, and as it expanded, it cooled down, and matter started to form together into protons and neutrons. We formed hydrogen and then helium, and then as it expanded further, after about 400 million years, the first stars started to be formed as gravity pulled this stuff together. Mostly hydrogen, and the gravity compressed it, and inside of these hydrogen stars, the pressure and the temperature was so great that the hydrogen turned into helium, and then into lithium and boron and carbon and so on, all the heavy elements that eventually make us up. And then after a few generations of that happened, the stars exploded, and the heavy elements were thrown out into space again, and they were pulled together by gravitation into the stars we see today. And our sun is one of those, and the earth is formed of those heavy elements containing carbon, which is the basis of our life. So that's the story in a nutshell of the universe. And it doesn't seem to fit with what the Bible says. And this is one of the points of conflict, as it were, that the Bible seems to tell us, or people would tell us, that the Bible tells a different story. That's not actually what happens. We'll come back to that later. But what we want to think about really is how can we reconcile the truth that we find through science and the truth that we find in Scripture, in what the Bible seems to be telling us. So there seems to be a point of conflict here that the Bible is telling us a different story. So our science and faith friends are foes. Well, if you were to listen to the new atheists, of course, they will tell you that they're inextricably opposed to one another. And interestingly, that has fed out into society at large. There was some research done a few years ago, in June 21, discovering that in the United Kingdom, in our own country, 58% of people, of adults, considered science and religion to be incompatible. So that's nearly 2/3 of people think that science and religion don't fit together. Only 29% thought they were compatible. When you look a bit deeper, it turns out that 23% considered science and religion to be strongly incompatible. They absolutely can't work together, fit together. And only 7% thought that they were strongly compatible. Now, I think those figures are quite startling. But that's the problem we're facing, if you like, as a church, how we counter that understanding of science and religion. So we have this problem, and part of the reason for today, as Daniel has pointed out, is to try to address that as Christians and as a church. So we've heard of Richard Dawkins, of course, one of the most famous atheists that we have in our country. He says that faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, and even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. So what he's saying really is that faith has nothing to do with science. There's no place in science. Science, in fact, is the enemy of faith. They are foes, quite definitely. Well, of course, Richard Dawkins is a well-known and quite famous zoologist, a respected scientist in his own field. But of course, not all scientists, as we've heard already, believe or think that way. Well, perhaps one of the greatest scientists of the last century, who actually got going the most successful theory we have of anything, quantum theory, was a man called Max Planck. And Planck said this: anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the temple of science are written the words, "Ye must have faith." What can he mean? What kind of faith is Planck talking about? That's one of the things we're going to try to think a bit about first of all this morning. So, to put it in context, of course, people have been thinking about these existential questions for thousands of years. And some of the very early religions in the ancient Near East and Far East saw the universe as a totally chaotic place. And the Babylonian myths, the early religion in Mesopotamia, thought of this chaos being tamed by the god Marduk, who defeated this monster Tiamat, a sea monster who was the personification of chaos. And out of that battle came mankind, and so on, everything flowed from that. But at the root of everything is basically chaos and disorder. And that's an interesting viewpoint. And of course, you could understand that because today we're mostly shielded by technology and kept safe from all sorts of things. But in those days, people are subject to random events, storms, invasions, brutal and violent deaths, disease that couldn't be treated. You couldn't tell what was going to happen from one day to the next. So life was random, accidental, chaotic. And therefore, in a sense, there's no point trying to see any point to it. And that's really what people were interested in. They weren't really interested in why the sky is blue. They didn't care about how things worked. They wanted to know what was going on here. And they thought something must be going on. There are some gods or some kind of creatures behind all this that are causing all this stuff to happen. And that was their most important issue. What's going on here, not how do things work. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Their worldview was concentrated on the why, what's going on here, not what's happening or how does it work. So the Babylonians weren't the only people who had that similar idea. The Greeks and the Romans also had this idea of capricious gods who just did what they wanted, and humans had to just suck it up, basically. Here's a statue of Zeus capturing a young woman and taking her off to Olympus to have his way with her, no doubt. And the poor woman had no choice, that she was just subject to the capricious whim of this god. And then there are other gods, of course. This one in particular, Fortuna, the goddess of chance and of luck and fate. You can see she holds in one hand a ship's tiller with which she can steer the course of events for people's lives. And in the other arm, she holds a horn of plenty that she can dispense to some people as she wishes. So disaster or good fortune, we're down to Fortuna, a lady. And today we worship Lady Luck. People who gamble basically worship Lady Luck. And that's where she comes from. So things are basically random and at the whim of these capricious gods. And that's the worldview into which comes a quite different way of thinking about things. And that is the God of the Jewish and Christian Bible. The idea is quite different. And that's why the book of Genesis stands out from all the other creation myths at the time. It speaks of a God imposing order on a chaos that perhaps even he created in the first place. The waters, the Spirit of God moved upon the waters, says Genesis. And one way of thinking about that is that even the chaotic waters was created by God. And out of that, he then formed order. And in a rational, coherent way, in a systematic, step-by-step, outlined in 6 days of creation, in definite orders, there's a pattern to it. And that was to draw the distinction not only between the kind of random capriciousness of the gods of the Babylonians and others, but also to point out that the gods that they worshipped, the sun and the moon and the stars and the spirits of the animals and so on, were not gods. They were created by the one true God. And that's the purpose of the book of Genesis. We'll come back to that later. So remember, God says, the book says, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them. Mankind was not made to be slaves of capricious gods. We are the product of a God of love. He made us to be objects of his love, not to be subject to the caprice and whims and turn into slaves for gods. That's a profound difference, a different way of looking at what's going on behind the world. In the New Testament, John emphasizes this, that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. So the theme from the beginning of the Bible to the end of our Christian Bible is a God of love. And that's a entirely different worldview from what was traditionally thought about as what was going on behind the world. So, in what way has that made a difference? Well, let's consider what this writer here, Charles Humble, says. He says that by purging the cosmic order of all gods and goddesses, the Genesis creation account de-divinized nature, got rid of the gods from nature, and made way for science that can probe and study every part of the universe without fearing either trespass or retribution. In other words, the world becomes a legitimate object of study. And we don't have to fear that some angry God is going to punish us for playing with it or doing things to it. We're invited to study God's creation. And that's what many years later, Kepler, after the introduction of the biblical idea, Kepler outlines this by saying the chief aim of science, of all investigations of the external world, should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God and which he has revealed to us in the language of mathematics. So if you're thinking of studying maths, good on you, okay? You're studying the language of God. So the very idea here Kepler is identifying is that there is an order there to be found. There's actually some point in looking for an order because it actually exists because it was created by a rational God. And that's an important principle that we need to bear in mind. Coming up to a bit more up to date, some more my generation, a very famous mathematical physicist, Eugene Wigner. I want to say that faith is essentially the basis of science because it says that there is an order to be found. This man, Eugene Wigner, said this about mathematics. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift, which we neither understand nor deserve. So how is it that we can understand why the sky is blue, that we can calculate the wavelength of light and why it interacts with molecules that way and describe it so accurately mathematically? Now, Eugene Wigner, I'm not sure what his religious view was, but he's certainly hinting here at something transcendent, something outside us, a miracle, a wonderful gift. A wonderful gift. That implies a giver, of course, doesn't it? So this was put explicitly by a philosopher and scientist, von Weizsäcker. The concept of exact mathematical laws of nature, which is only dimly present in Greek thought, gained far greater convincing power by the means of the Christian concept of creation. It was a sort of Christian radicalism which transformed nature from the house of gods into the realm of law. So, this idea that these laws exist, that are laws of nature that have been given to us, implies a lawgiver. And going back then to what Planck was saying, of course, this is evidence that there's some rationality behind it all. And when we start to look into it more deeply, we find all sorts of clues, bits of evidence that the universe in which we live is fine-tuned for life. Now, I could spend the rest of today going through dozens of the random coincidences, things that are just right for life. I'll tell you one or two of them. For example, we talked earlier about how these heavy elements like carbon were created in the hearts of stars. But when you start to look at it, it turned out that there seems to be far more carbon than there should be because of the laws of physics. And it turned out that what happens is that atoms of nuclei of helium collide together. Now they weigh, they've got 2 protons in the center, these 2 little plus signs, and 2 neutrons. And when 3 of them collide together, they stick and make carbon. Now, actually, that's very unlikely to happen. 3 things sticking together like that. And it's remarkable that it happens at all. And it turns out that a man called Fred Hoyle, who is an astrophysicist and theoretical physicist, calculated the probability of this happening using what he knew about the laws, the forces between the nuclei of these particles. And he calculated that actually there would be what's called a resonance, a kind of natural frequency of these things that wobble together. Just happened to be, it turned out to be just right because of the strength of these forces. And he said, well, that's totally weird. Because what that means is that when this happens, it's much more likely than it otherwise would be because of this sort of natural resonance. And he said this, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Now, Fred Hoyle was an atheist. He believed that the universe had always existed, that matter was eternal. He didn't like the idea of a creation, of a beginning to the universe, because it sounded a wee bit too much like religion, and so he was fiercely opposed to it. And yet, the scientific evidence gave him second thoughts, of course, that there must be something going on here. He says a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics. If you like, a cosmic mind has been at work here. And I think that's quite interesting because he wasn't following a religious agenda. He's simply saying that there's evidence here of something going on, a mind behind it. That's just one of these natural coincidences. I could go on all day. As I say, one of my favorites, actually, which never gets mentioned, is the fact that we have a moon. What's that got to do with anything? Did you realize that if the moon wasn't there, we wouldn't be here? Because what the moon does, it's just the right size and it's just the right distance from the Earth that it acts as a kind of stabilizer wheel on a bicycle. If it wasn't there, the Earth's axis would tip over and over over millions of years and cause catastrophic climate change. You know, the North Pole would turn upside down, as it were, and life would be wiped out. But the moon keeps us in a steady orientation relative to its orbit around the sun. That's a freaky accident, isn't it? Now, there's lots of things like that happen. And the thing is that when something unlikely happens, you say, well, okay, it's just chance. Say you roll a dice and you want a 6. You've got a 1 in 6 chance of getting a 6, or any number. If you want 2 6s and you roll it twice, then the chances are 1 in 6 and 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. You have to multiply the probabilities. So every time you do that with independent random events, the probability gets even smaller. Now, you put together all these coincidences, each with a very low probability, and multiply them all together, you get an absolutely tiny probability of it happening just by chance. When you do the sums, in fact, another atheist has done the sums for us. Sorry, let me just go on here. That what we're thinking about is why we can understand things here. That our ability to think things through is a reflection of the way God has made us. That we have something of the image of God in us. That it explains, if you like, that the fact that we can understand anything about the universe, as Einstein says, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, makes sense if there's a mind behind the universe and our minds work in something like the same way. So it makes a kind of coherent, sensible way to think about things. So what Kepler was saying was that by the language of mathematics and thinking about the world's order, we are thinking God's thoughts after him. And that's because we are in some sense made in his image. There's something about the way our mind works follows the way God's mind works. And of course, if God wanted us to have a relationship with him, that would have to be the case. We'll come back to that later. So what we're talking about here is the underlying order of things that we discover by scientific methods and by thinking rationally about it. And we find that when we go back to what the Bible says, that God created man in his own image, there's something about our way our minds work that reflects God's thinking. And John picks up that story at the beginning when he's talking about creation, and he's talking about Jesus coming into this world as God in human form. He says that in the beginning, at the start of all things, was the Word. And the Greek word was logos, the expression of God. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. Now, for the Greeks, the Logos was the fundamental underlying principle of the universe, the rational principle that underlies everything that exists. This is a Greek idea, and fair play to them for coming up with that notion. But what John is saying is that that actually derives from the Creator himself. And when he came to reveal himself in human form, it was that Creator God who comes to show what he's like. And it makes sense to us. So, by looking at the world that God has made, we can make sense of things. So in the first part here, what I'm saying is that faith in the Creator, if you like, got modern science as we know it going. Out of all the other ideas that fed into it, from the Muslim world, from classical Greek philosophy and so on, it was the idea of a Creator God that really, in the Middle Ages, got modern science off the ground and nourished it. And then we find that when we look objectively at modern science, what it tells us, it provides evidence pointing back to this rational Creator, that there's evidence of a mind behind it. So far so good, you might think, but actually there's another side to this, isn't there, which we all know about, because there are many people who think that science actually proves the opposite. And they think that really faith means believing stuff that isn't true, and that the only thing you can really trust is science. It tells us the truth, facts, not imagination, not faith, not make-believe, and therefore science is the only thing we can really trust. And science tells us that really, when you look at it, we're just the chance products of a purposeless process. The universe sprang into being with a quantum fluctuation, all this random stuff going on, and we just happen to turn up by a freak of all these things coming together. And at the end of the day, when you get right down to it, we're just made of atoms and molecules, and that's all there is. Material stuff is the only thing that really exists. So that's what is today called the philosophy or metaphysics of scientism. And it's a kind of religion, if you like, because when we think about it, we need faith to believe that. Because we're presented with the same evidence, and some people put their faith in the fact that it's coming from a rational God, and some people put their faith in the idea that it's just a random process, and there's nothing more to be said. That's what we call scientism, or that we're only made of atoms and molecules. That's materialism. And we can explain everything by natural processes or naturalism. So in this sense, scientism undermines faith because it says that it must be a delusion, because really the only thing we can trust is what science can tell us. And therefore, we have these conclusions. For example, that one that arrived out by Jacques Monod, molecular biologist, Man at last knows that he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he has emerged by chance. Very small chance, but there you are, that's all it is. And then the Big Bang, of course, explains how we've come to be here from that initial fluctuation and how the stars and all have evolved. And some of the people who worked on this theory, like Stephen Weinberg, says that the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. Well, I want you to notice the sleight of hand that Professor Weinberg has slipped in there. He has started off with physics. We can understand the physics of the Big Bang and how stars are made and how we got to be here. And then he smuggles in some metaphysics. It's pointless. Purpose, meaning, are ideas, metaphysical ideas, philosophical ideas, if you like. They're meaningful to us. We know what they mean, and we want to know those sort of answers to those questions. But it's not science, it's not physics. So we have to bear in mind the distinction between physics and metaphysics, and sometimes our scientist colleagues blur the distinction there. They think that physics is all there is, and therefore it must include metaphysics too. Well, it doesn't. So, I mentioned earlier that when we think about the sums, the chances that this is just a chance process, and we actually do the sums, or as the Americans say, do the math. This was done by Roger Penrose, colleague at Oxford, very famous theoretical physicist, very bright man, not particularly religious, but he worked out the degree of order that had to be present at the start of the universe in order to have what we have today, the degree of order and disorder. And he worked it out to be one chance in 10 to the power of a big number, 10 to the power of 123. Now, there isn't room on the screen to write all the zeros that would mean. In fact, that is way more than all the protons in the entire universe. That's what the chance means. And some people are prepared to put their faith in that. That they'll put their faith that we're just that one in a gazillion chance, rather than the evidence that points to God. Now, what my colleague Penrose says here, he's not religious, he doesn't believe in a personal God, but he says that looking at the facts, the evidence here, I would say that the universe has a purpose. It's not there just somehow by chance. That's another objective observation from an atheist scientist, just like Hoyle before him. Looking at the bare facts points towards a purpose and a mind behind the universe. And I think that's significant. Let's look at the other idea that science tells us that really we're just nothing but atoms and molecules. And I want you to imagine you come into a room in your school or university or college, and let me just go on to this next point, that we're nothing but atoms and molecules. And we see on the board here these funny markings. Someone has written with chalk these funny things on the blackboard, and you ask, well, what's that? And someone will tell you, well, actually, it's stuff called calcium carbonate or chalk that's been put onto a black painted surface. And when you analyze it, there's carbon atoms and calcium atoms and oxygen atoms, and that's all there is. Come on, there must be more to it than that. No, it's just atoms and molecules. But anybody who looks at that is going to say, no, that can't be just random atoms and molecules. And in fact, anybody know what those are? Those are Maxwell's equations. Those are the equations that describe light, electromagnetic waves. They were developed by James Clerk Maxwell, incidentally another very devout Christian, one of the most underrated scientists of all time, actually, because his theories of electromagnetism underpin all of our modern technology. Our mobile phones, our televisions, you name it, comes from electromagnetic theory. These equations These equations mean something. They tell us how the electric field and magnetic field are related to the speed of light. And actually that led on to the theory of relativity, and Einstein took them on, and the whole thing grew from there. So Maxwell produced these equations, and they mean something. They aren't just atoms and molecules. That's the fallacy of nothing buttery. If you just reduce everything to atoms and molecules, you miss the meaning of what's there. Now, any sensible person doesn't go through life like that, ignoring signs like that and saying, oh, it's just atoms and molecules. But that's what our atheist friends are asking us to do. So, it's not just me as a Christian saying this. I've quoted a couple of atheists who have looked at the evidence and realized there's something funny going on here, but they aren't prepared to take that step of faith. Here's another atheist I'm going to quote in regard to this fallacy of nothing buttery, that we're nothing but atoms and molecules. A man called J.B.S. Haldane, who was a molecular biologist, evolutionary theorist in the early 20th century, he said this, and this makes the fatal flaw in scientism and materialism clear. He says this: if we were just atoms and molecules, then even what's going on in my brain is just what atoms and molecules are doing. And he said this: if my mental processes, if my thoughts, my thinking are determined wholly by the motion of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason to suppose my brain to be composed of atoms. You see, he realizes that if materialism is true, then we can't know anything. Nothing is true. It's just what is. It's, if you like, as C.S. Lewis put it, a proof that there are no proofs. It's a logical contradiction. It cannot be true. Materialism cannot be all there is. Of course, we are atoms and molecules, but that cannot be the whole story. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know we're made of atoms and molecules. It doesn't make sense. And remember, at the beginning, our truth has to make sense. It has to come together. And materialism or naturalism just doesn't add up. So there's an even more fundamental problem, and that was realized by someone who needs to be thought of as perhaps even more brilliant than Newton. Einstein thought this man was the cleverest person who'd ever lived, that he'd ever met, a young man called Kurt Gödel. And he said this: he worked out this logical theorem using mathematical logic, and the result was that some statements within a mathematical or logical system, any argument if you like, that starts off with axioms or assumptions and works through logically, any system like that can have statements within a system that may be true, but you can't prove it from within that system. Oh dear. Another atheist, Bertrand Russell, got very upset about this because he thought that number theory could prove everything. And then Gödel comes along and says, no, you can't do that because number theory is just a closed system and you need something outside that to validate it. So philosophically, it doesn't make sense. And this man really shows it logically and demonstrably. So what he's saying is, in other words, that we need something outside the system to validate it. And that includes our own reason, our own rationality. So what we're saying is that scientism says there's nothing outside the natural system, nothing to validate our reason even, nothing to give us confidence that we even have atoms and molecules in our brain. However, theism, the belief in God, isn't trapped like that, because it says there is someone outside the natural system, and that's God. And so our reason can be traced back to the mind of God, the mind behind the universe. And to me, that makes sense. It's coherent truth. And that's what Blaise Pascal, perhaps another very brilliant man, says, that what our reason does is tells us so much, but then it points beyond itself. The supreme function of reason is to show man that some things are beyond reason. Reason will take us so far. My favorite quote from C.S. Lewis is that if reason cannot tell you if the cat is in the linen cupboard, then reason itself will whisper, go and look. There are limits to what our reason, what our science can tell us. But even there, we will get clues and hints to look elsewhere for what we need to know. And that's what reason is for. So our reason is an important gift from God. And God actually invites us. In Isaiah, he says, "Come, let us reason together. Though your sins are as scarlet, they shall be white as snow." Actually, the more important thing is your moral state that needs fixing. Let's reason together about it. Think about it. So reason is the heart of our faith. So let's wind things up here. Some conclusions about science and faith. First of all, that it was faith in our Creator that actually led to the modern science that we know today, that belief that there was an orderliness that could be discovered. And the scientific evidence that we find when we do that points back to that mind, that Creator. It's not a circular argument. Just we start off with an assumption that there's an order to be found, and then we go looking for it, and it is there, everywhere, from the smallest cell to the most distant galaxy, all the way through the universe. And what's more, we can understand it. And we find that when we think about it, that the idea that scientism and materialism, saying that there's nothing else other than atoms and molecules, is logically self-defeating. It does not make sense. It's not coherent. It doesn't tie together. And so therefore we come to this conclusion that our faith is rationally justified. Now, I don't want to just leave it there, and we'll come back to this subject later on this afternoon, but what we're saying is that we can have confidence in our faith, that it is not opposed to science, it actually is complementary. We're looking at two sides of the same reality. But our faith is not just signing up to some propositions about God. It's entering into a relationship with Him whereby we discover knowledge that goes beyond what science can tell us. So I don't want us to leave today thinking that if we know enough about science, we can prove that God exists, or we can convince everybody to become Christians. It doesn't work like that. But we've made a start, and we'll come back to that later. Thanks very much.
I think, yes. So, Paul, thank you so much. That was great food for thought. There's so much in there to think about. Now, you may think that we're running behind, but we're not. We're going to just move things, shift things a little bit, because with a smaller number, lunch is not going to take, a full hour. So we want to still just give a few minutes for a question and answer. If you have something, of general interest for Paul. However, just so you know, immediately after that, we'll be dividing up into different groups, and I'll show you what those groups are in just a few minutes. And Paul is going to be at one of those groups. So if you have any specific questions you want to ask him about, he's going to be staying in this room with two other people, so you'll have that opportunity as well. But we'll give a couple minutes for Q&A now. Yeah.
Oh, we've got one here. Sorry?
You would agree that the Bible says we are made from the dust of the earth,
Yes.
the dust of formed from the clay. So in that regard, we are atoms and molecules, are we not?
Yes.
I think Descartes thought the soul was in the pineal gland or something. I don't think doctors would agree with that. So there is some truth in we are made of the dust, and that is coherent, if you like, with your scientific idea. So what is the difference? I think, without being over Platonic, form matters. The fact that you are a form of Homo sapien makes us able to conceive of the universe and have these ideas. So where is the spirit that obviously God talks about? What is different about the human form that we can conceive of God and all these thoughts? I mean, and consciousness, those problems. Is there something, and do you think science will ever discover that or not?
Okay.
Or is that too metaphysical?
Can I come back to that in about 30 seconds after I tell you a joke? You made the point that we're made of dust, okay, and that science has told us a lot about how we're made up. In fact, we're actually in the process of being able to manufacture DNA bit by bit. And so a group of scientists have got the idea that actually we don't need God anymore. We can create life. We can do whatever we want. And so they got a little delegation together and they sent them off to tell God that he could retire. You know, that now we've sorted things out. We can make our own life. We can do anything we want. Just put our minds to it. And God says, that's very interesting. But you may recall that I made you out of the dust of the earth. Could you do that? And the scientist said, yeah, sure, and picks up some dust and goes to walk off with it. And God said, not so fast there. You make your own dust. So the difference between creation and evolution, if you like, is the creation is the bringing into existence of matter and energy and all that exists. That's what creation is. It isn't making stuff out of some preformed, pre-existent stuff, as it were. So God is the reason why there's something rather than nothing. We'll come back to that later as well. So having said that, we have this stuff, the atoms and molecules that make us up. Is that all there is? Or is, as you say, something more, a mind, a spirit? There is a growing sense in science itself, actually, over the last 100 years or so, of what is called emergence. And what I've been talking about in terms of materialism is called reductionism, that you reduce everything all down to the smallest bits and then explain everything in terms of the smallest bits. But it turns out that even within physics, that doesn't work. Because there's this wonderful phenomenon called superconductivity, for example, whereby the electrons can move through wires without any resistance. The wire doesn't heat up, and you can get huge currents flowing very easily if you get the stuff cold enough. Now, it turns out that if you think of the reduction this way, each individual electron wanders around, bounces off the atoms, and slows down. That's called resistance. But if one electron says to another electron, hey, you're up and I'm down, let's pair up, okay? And they act as two, then they can jiggle around and get through these bumpy atoms in their way without any resistance. And that's how superconductivity works. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the quantum theory allows us to work that out, actually, that it's not just in terms of individual particles, but actually things that act at a distance, as it were. Don't get me started on that, because I was doing a bit of that sort of stuff myself. Anyway, so the point is that you can't predict superconductivity on the basis of individual electrons. It emerges when you've got two. So once you get something a little more complicated, new stuff emerges that isn't present in the basic stuff itself. And it could be that our mind's consciousness is of that nature, an ability of cells in the brain to do stuff that would be impossible to understand just on the basis of the chemistry of cells. And that once enough cells get together in an organic living form, and life itself is an interesting emergent phenomenon, okay? Because life itself is different from inanimate matter, stuff and dust. There's something different about life. That's an emergent property of matter. And so we've gone from elementary particles to atoms to molecules to dust to cells to brains, and then brains start to think. That's another emergent phenomenon. And maybe our spiritual nature is a yet more emergent phenomenon that's inherent. It's not separate from, but it's built in. And that's the Hebrew idea of humanity. We're not like little shells inhabited by a snail that get carried around, and when we die, we leave the body and so on. We're an integral being, body, mind, and spirit. That's the biblical idea of humanity. And that's why the resurrection of the body is important. A new kind of body will be given. That's another story. But what I'm talking about here is emergence. the idea that the scientific approach of reductionism, it doesn't tell the whole story. And that certainly opens up the possibility that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon that occurs when you've got a living organism of a certain degree of complexity. And that required a lot of evolution to get there. But the mechanism of getting there doesn't explain the meaning or purpose of it. Question back there, yes?
Just picking up on the dusting, if it is true that from dust we came and to dust we return, and there's somebody coming or going underneath that drum kit, it's dusty.
Okay, yes.
But serious question. Would you like to comment, and perhaps using that verse as an example, would you like to make any comment on the way in which some Christians use the Bible to try to draw scientific conclusions when those scientific conclusions were never intended by the original author and wouldn't be heard by the first hearers? And yet we try to do it today. Just any comments on that?
Well, I will be making some comments on that in my second talk, actually. But very briefly, you're absolutely right that, as I mentioned at the beginning, in thousands of years ago, people weren't interested in the mechanisms. Their worldview was entirely different. They were thinking about different. They looked at the world in a different way than we do. And the people who wrote Genesis and the early books of the Bible were in that culture. They were addressing the worldview at the time, and they used ideas from the cosmology of the time to get across their point, their theological point. They weren't really interested in the mechanisms. And so this idea of concordism between what the Bible says and science, I think, is mistaken. It underpins what I call the cult of creationism. That for the best will in the world, they're trying to do what they think is right, to make the Bible convincing, as it were. But they actually, I think, have the opposite effect. They make it more difficult for people to take the Bible seriously if it's being offered as an alternative explanation. It was never intended to be that. It was intended to show us that we are the object of God's love, that there's a purpose to our lives, and that we need God in our lives. We need to have him at the center, to worship him and not the created order. That's the purpose of Genesis and the Bible as a whole, and it shouldn't be mistaken for a science textbook. Oh. I heard you the first time.
My question is probably less about like science and the way we've been talking and faith. It's more about like the Bible versus evolution. On the sixth day, God created Adam and Eve, but yet there is a lot of evidence of dinosaurs, of all these things that have been there for millions of years. And it's really hard to explain, well, if God created Adam and Eve on the sixth day and it created everything else before that, where does it all fit in? And I think that, for me as a Christian, is the hardest thing to explain to people who haven't got a faith. Have you got a thought on that?
Well, as I've just said, I think the way to understand the Genesis story of creation is not as a science textbook or as meant to tell us how and when and how long it took. Even within itself, there are clues to the kind of literature that it is, and it's certainly not like the kind of literature we read today in a modern book. The whole structure of it, the context in which it was written against the ideas of the surrounding peoples, was designed to make a theological point, not a scientific point. And therefore, it does no service to the Bible to try to force it to say things it didn't mean to say. It doesn't mean to say it was formed in 6 literal days. I know that there are some of our brothers and sisters who want to believe that and think it's important to believe that. I respectfully think that it's unfortunate that they do that, because it's not necessary to do that. In fact, it gets in the way. of really understanding what the point of the book is. It's not there to tell us how God made the world or when or where. It's why he made it, what the purpose of it is. And so all I can do is encourage you to use examples where you have to read literature in the form it is. You read a poem, which will have metaphor and similes and all sorts of uses of words that aren't meant to be taken literally, but convey a truth. And so the important thing is, what is this trying to tell us? Not how is it saying it, as it were. You have to understand the kind of literature we're reading. But there's a whole can of worms there that we could go into when we have more time. Okay.
Right. I think we better carry on. We'll have more time for questions. Now, today was a day partly meant for, listening to an engaging speaker, which we've done. That's been fascinating. But we also want this day to be for you to be able to talk and discuss and share and raise questions, and that's what our next session is about.